Hi everybody, and welcome back to Profiles from the Titanic on the Horizon's Edge channel, where we take a look at people who did not make it off of the RMS Titanic, and we find out a little bit more about them, right? And so I'm also a stat kind of guy. I love stats. Baseball is one of my favorite sports, and so it's a very stat-driven sport and that kind of thing. And so when you start looking at kind of weird numbers, that kind of gets my interest up, right? And so as I was researching and doing other stuff about people on board the Titanic, this one number started popping out at me. And that was the number of first-class women passengers that were on board the Titanic. Do you happen to know the number? Well, the generally accepted consensus is that there were 144 first-class women passengers on board the ship. Okay, so there you go, 144. Well, that's not the end all, right? The next stat that comes up is, do you know how many out of those 144 survived the sinking of the Titanic? That number is 140. That's right. 140 out of 144 survived. So now, as a stat person, right, you have that number. What's the first question that comes up? Well, out of all of those, who were the four that did not make it? And so there's your profile right there. So I started looking into those, and that's why I wanted to do the profile on the four first-class women passengers who did not make it off the ship. Now, the survival rate, if you do the math on that, it's 97%. So 97% of the first-class women survived. So who were these four? And we're going to take a look at that very briefly, just give you short little profiles, but we're also going to do something a little bit different in this profile today. I'm not going to do the real formal kind of narrated version, that I normally do. We're just going to sit here and kind of talk about it. I'll show you the photos as we go along, right? And we'll find out a little bit more about these two, and about the four. And there's two categories, actually, as you subdivide them. Two of the women were married. Two of the women were actually single ladies. And so we will cover the two married ladies first, and we will go ahead and get started right now. Again, hit the subscribe and the like button and your notification bell, and whenever I put a new video, you can be notified about that. Okay, let's go ahead and put up that first video right now, and you will immediately know who the first person is. Why? Because we have actually done a profile on them. Of course, this is Isidore and Ida Strauss, right? The owners of Macy's department store. They were coming back from their vacation, and we know all of that. And I invite you, we're not going to spend too much time on Ida Strauss because, like I said, we've already done a profile. Please check out my other videos. Check out the Ida and Isidore Strauss profile. But the one thing with their story, and oh, by the way, she was also, out of the four ladies that we're going to cover, she's the oldest. She was 63 years old, traveling with her husband. And the story there goes that they were, again, very early. They were up in the first class section on the boat deck. The first class people, remember, they were up there. Their cabins were like ABC decks. They had very quick and easy access to the A-deck promenade, the boat deck. And so they could have gotten to boats very early, and a lot of them did. And so what happens is Isidore and Ida Strauss, they get to lifeboat number 8. This boat was launched right at about 1 o'clock in the morning. Again, this was only about 20 minutes after the very first boats were launched. And the thing is that she was going to get on board. They did not let the men, for the most part, get on board. This was on the port side. Even numbers were on the port side. So remember, this was Charles Lightoller. No men were allowed. Well, when she realized that, she got off the lifeboat. And she told her husband, as we know, where you go, I go. We've lived together. We're going to die together. And so the one thing about her, though, is that she knew what she was doing. She knew the ramifications of her decision, that they were going to die together, right? So that's one thing. Keep that in mind as we look at the other ones as well. And lifeboat number 8, remember, it was one of the early boats, and the most tragic thing about all this is that it still had 40 seats available when they launched that lifeboat. I mean, they could have gotten on there. A whole bunch of other people could have gotten on there, but they didn't. And so in some way, a lot of people, remember, out of all the lifeboats, the capacity, 500 more people could have survived. You actually could have had slightly more than half of everybody on board surviving the sinking, believe it or not. maybe about 1,000 would have died. But as it turns out, those 500, they didn't get on the lifeboats. Most of the lifeboats left half full, and you had a lot of empty seats. And this was a case here with Ida Strauss. And again, 40 empty seats on their lifeboat. And so they didn't need to die. They could have gotten on there. And she was one of those. So she was the first of the first-class women passengers that didn't make it, Ida Strauss. Now we go to the second one. Let's go ahead and put this picture up. And this is the Allisons, Hudson and Bess Allison. They were traveling first class. They were, again, very wealthy, very well-to-do. And in fact, they have 2 children, little Lorraine, who was 2 years old at the time, and then little Trevor, who was 11 months old. So about 2 years old and 1 year old. And they were so well off that actually they had 3 first-class cabins. Hudson and Bess, they had 1 cabin. A nanny and Lorraine had a 2nd cabin. And another nanny and Trevor had a 3rd cabin. They also had some additional servants in 2nd class. So, these cabins were not cheap, thousands of dollars by today's standard. They had several of them, so they were very well-to-do. But they were also rather young, actually. Bess Allison, out of the 4 ladies that we're talking about today, Bess was actually the youngest. She was only 25 years old. And they were getting on board lifeboat number 6. Now, here's the really weird story about this, is that Hudson had gone up to find out what was going on, right? So he was her husband. Well, during that time, the nanny, Alice Cleaver was her name, who was watching little Trevor, the stewards were coming by, right, and telling him, hey, come, get the life belts on, get up to the deck, right? Well, Alice takes Trevor. She goes up to the boat deck. They're going up to the boat deck. She gets on a boat and they launch. Now here's the thing. Bess has Lorraine. They end up getting on another lifeboat somewhere along the way. She gets separated from Hudson, and it's Bess and little 2-year-old Lorraine. Well, all of a sudden, Bess realizes that Hudson, her husband, is not there. Trevor and the nanny are not there. So you can imagine, she starts probably freaking out. Well, where are they? Where are they? So the story there goes that they got off the boat. She went to basically try to go find her husband and the nanny with Trevor. And so we actually find this out a little bit by Major Arthur Pushin. And remember, this is lifeboat number 6. So this is the kind of rather famous lifeboat with Margaret Brown, Quartermaster Hitchens, right? Who was at the wheel when the iceberg struck the Titanic, right? And so that kind of real crazy lifeboat situation there with those people on board. So Arthur Pushin was the one who kind of told about this story that Bess Allison gets off the lifeboat. Well, sure enough, it launches without her. So she gets left off the lifeboat. In the end, we don't know what happened. There is a story that supposedly they may have reunited. She may have found her husband, but by that point it was so late that there were no lifeboats left. And so ultimately what ends up happening is Hudson, Bess, and also little 2-year-old Lorraine, they end up dying on the Titanic. The interesting thing there is that the nanny with Trevor, Trevor ends up surviving. Of course, that's not a good situation. Now, he's only a baby, he doesn't know, but his entire family is wiped out, his sister and both of his parents. He ends up, as an aside, by the way, he ends up being taken in by an uncle and aunt and raised by them. But in case you think, again, these stories, you can't make this stuff up. In case you think he kind of lived happily ever after, not so fast. He grows up there with his uncle and aunt and so forth, but he also ends up with a tragic story. When he was 18 years old, he dies of food poisoning. So the entire Allison family totally gets wiped out, ultimately. The 3 of them on the Titanic, And then little Trevor, again, who survived the tragedy, ends up dying when he's 18 years old of food poisoning. So again, just a tragic story. I kind of sometimes think that I may end up doing a series on the people who survived but had terrible luck later on. And so the Allisons probably deserve their own profile by themselves, but I'm kind of covering it in this one because of Bess Allison. So there you go. Bess Allison, she was the youngest of the first-class women to die. She was only 25 years old, and that's her story. And the sad thing about that one is that, you know, she may not have made that decision to get out of the lifeboat thinking that, well, she's going to get out and she's going to die. She was probably making the decision to try to find her husband and then child, whatever, and get back onto the lifeboat. And so who knows what may have happened there. So that's a kind of an extra tragic quirk to the story, unlike Ida Strauss, who definitely knew the decision that she was making. But anyway, Bess Allison is the second of the 4 first-class women to die on board the Titanic. So now we switch gears, and now we go to the 2 ladies who were actually single. The first one is she goes by the name of Anne Isham. She's the third one that we're going to talk about. Now, Anne was a single lady. She had actually been living in Paris for about 12 years at that time. She was from a very prominent legal family in the Chicago area. And she was coming back to the United States. She had boarded at Cherbourg in France. And she was coming to spend the summer with her brother, who she hadn't seen for some time. And so she was traveling over. And she is 50 years old. So she's, you know, not too young or anything, but she was already middle-aged. She was 50 years old, and she was coming over, and there's not a lot of detail about exactly what happened to Anne Isham. There was one kind of weird, uncorroborated story that she was in the lifeboat, but then suddenly she got off the lifeboat. One story, and apparently there is no substantiated information about this. It's just a wild rumor, but that supposedly she may have seen another passenger get on board with maybe a little tiny dog, and there was a rumor that supposedly she had a big breed dog, or like a Great Dane. This is some of the stories that circulated around out there, and that supposedly she jumped off the lifeboat to save her dog, and that supposedly some days later on one of the passing ships they reported sighting of a woman with her arms floating. You know, they were frozen. They were dead in the water around a big dog. And so the name of Anne Isham got kind of associated with that story, but apparently it has been kind of debunked that supposedly they say that Anne Isham did not have a pet. She did not have a dog on the Titanic. And we really just don't know what happened, her whereabouts and what she did and what she, you know, how she moved, or whether she was on the lifeboat or not. Not a lot of information out there about Anne Isham, but unfortunately she was the third of the first-class women who did not make it off the Titanic. And so that was the third one. And then the final one is this young lady right here. Now, she was 36 years old. This is Edith Evans. She was also unmarried, and she was a very, you know, socially, what would you say? I guess like very moved in social circles in various aspects here in the United States. She was an American, and she was traveling with some other elderly women who, you know, they were married and had family members and this sort of thing. And late in the boarding of the lifeboats, as they tried to board, apparently Edith did not make it onto any of the boats. This was already very late by the time they were able to get to the lifeboats. Colonel Archibald Gracie, now we've heard of him before, right? He actually did survive, and we know a lot about the sinking because of him, and he wrote one of the first books in 1912 about the sinking. Apparently he offered his services and would help the ladies and this and that with her little group, and so Colonel Gracie got them up there near the front of the boat, near the front of the ship, near the end, and supposedly like they tried to get people on collapsible D. And this is kind of where the story originates, that we're not exactly 100% sure, but they're saying that there was only room for like 1 or 2 more people on the boat, and that supposedly Edith Evans, being an unmarried single woman, she turned to her companions who were married and had children, and that supposedly the story goes that she said, "No, you are married and have children, you go." And she basically sacrificed herself. She did not go. Now, we don't know if that's 100% true, but that is kind of one of the stories attached to Edith here. They say that ultimately, once Collapsible D left, she may have gone to the other side of the boat to try to get on, because remember, Collapsible B, which was right next to it, was overturned. So she probably, if this is true, and she saw that, she probably figured, well, forget that boat. That's not going anywhere. So she ran across to the other side. Again, this is just a rumor that supposedly she was possibly seen at Collapsible A. Now remember, Collapsible A was it was a nightmare of a boat as well. It did get washed off the deck, but there was a foot of water in it. There was people on it. This was the boat that, remember, Rhoda Abbott got pulled onto, who survived ultimately. But I think there was only, if I'm correct, about 13 people who ultimately survived off of Collapsible A. But the story there goes that there was about like 8 people who literally were in the boat but died, and they were like either got washed off or were in the bottom of the boat. There is some unsubstantiated rumors that maybe Edith Evans was one of those people who possibly got onto Collapsible A but succumbed to the cold in the boat, and perhaps her body was washed off. Now, the interesting thing about all 4 of these women was that none of them were ever found. Ida Strauss, as you know, was never found. Bess Allison, none of the Allisons were found. Anne Isham was never found, and Edith Evans, never found by the recovery ship. And so just tragic stories with all of these 4 women, but there you have it. I mean, out of, again, 144 women, only 4 did not make it. And as we come back here, thanks for watching again, Profiles from the Titanic. And there's actually one little tiny postscript to that. We had mentioned that with Bess Allison, the young mother, and remember her 2-year-old Lorraine, that also perished with her mother. Unfortunately for Lorraine Allison, the little 2-year-old, she, in perishing on board the Titanic, she was the only first or second class child to die on board the Titanic. So she holds that distinction as well. None of the other first and second class children passed away on the Titanic, with the sole exception of Lorraine Allison. So again, just a tragic story. The little 2-year-old didn't make it off when they could have. Like I said, that she was on the boat, but she didn't make it. But anyway, those are the numbers, those are the stats, and just intriguing, very intriguing stories that you find all along the way here. But I hope you enjoyed this profile from the Titanic. Hit the subscribe and the like button, and once again, thanks for watching Profiles from the Titanic.